Good film, huh? Good, good, good. Right, I'm going to shut up. We've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A. And then if you would like to come out to the bar and carry on having a chat, or if you want to, you can stay in here. We've got Benjamin Percy over from the US to talk about his book. He's going to be doing a reading. And then we've got 2 episodes of Hemlock Grove. So we'll come in and see it. So I'll pass you. You can talk to her during the credits. So. Vera, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll leave you in the capable hands of Alex Fitch. Thank you, Alex.
So, Thelma and Louise meets When the Wind Blows.
Oh! Don't know when the wind blows.
Work it out.
Okay.
So, where's the idea of this post-apocalyptic road trip come from?
Bria and I are huge lovers of horror, sci-fi, fantasy, comic books, what have you, and we actually cooked up the idea of writing a horror film, truthfully, because of our love of horror. And we actually started the script together, with both of us starring in it, and we got about 60 pages into the script. It's really quite good. I read it recently. We were doing some research, and we watched a French film called Martyrs, for those of you who might have seen it. And we're ill-prepared for just actually how gruesome and awful the film is. It's done so spectacularly well that I couldn't finish watching it. And about half an hour into the film, I turned to Bria and sort of only half jokingly said, why don't we make a romantic comedy instead? Because as actors, we started to recognize, I think Bria and I, we bonded because of our simultaneous love of horror and sci-fi and fantasy, but also a very explicit feminist identification and ideology. And we talked about the tension of being feminists while still loving these genres that create stories that are often disempowering to women. So we thought we'd write a horror film that would sort of, you know, speak to both of those loves. But then we just thought, why are we doing this? It's too gruesome. And so Bria was actually driving her car, on a road trip, and she just said, it's so desolate in this landscape. If anyone's ever been to the US and been on that route from LA to Austin, it actually looks like the apocalypse happened multiple generations ago. And so she called me, because we were sort of searching. And we both love apocalypse stories, and this sort of seemed to, it just kind of organically evolved from there.
Did you fully script it, or was part of the dialogue improvised on the road?
No, it's fully scripted.
Okay.
I mean...
It's quite naturalistic. It feels like the two of you were just almost playing yourselves sometimes. I mean, not in a kind of post-psychotic, you know, all the way to college.
Yeah, I can see that. You know, we played with the idea of actually having a lot of improvisation, and there's really, we shot the film on Super 16, so, and on a very low budget, so for those who know, it's actually really expensive, so we don't have a tremendous amount of extra footage. But we did devote a lot of it to the Alexes, who are actually 2/3 of an incredible improv group in Los Angeles, and we let them improv whatever they wanted to, and we ruined several takes because our crew kept laughing. Those, we have a lot of choice improvisational scenes, but the rest of it is actually scripted. Yeah.
I mean, thinking of roles for women in kind of post-apocalyptic fiction, in horror and sci-fi, I mean, there seem to be the two extremes of women in kind of like leather catsuits, shooting people, or
which,
victims.
by the way, I would love to be in.
Thanks, Phil. But it seems that there isn't actually a fully formed female character in many of these movies. And I was wondering if that was kind of what you were reacting against.
I hesitate to say that there's a lack of fully formed. That's probably true, but I also just have a genre love and faith that there's maybe more intelligence than sometimes the wider world gives credit to those who love genre films. And horror, less and less sci-fi, seem to be the areas where women do play lead roles, and roles that have their protagonists as well as the heroines. And perhaps those stories still need to evolve and enrichen, and that's maybe more of a function of sort of that necessary evolution of storytelling generally. But so I know, I do know what you're saying, but I think that there's a lot of good material out there, and there's a lot of room to grow. Yeah.
In terms of reinventing the apocalypse movie after the millennium, has that been kind of a hard thing to do? Because it's almost like we kept on expecting the end of the world to come, and then it never did, with like Y2K,
Yeah.
with all the Christian fundamentalists a year ago who sold all their belongings and invested in billboards saying it's the end of the world, and then it didn't happen. I mean, you kind of toy with that a little bit in this movie, and the fact that it does happen, but the pair of you are oblivious to it.
We are oblivious to it. I often say that I don't consider this a post-apocalyptic film, because I think when you say post-apocalyptic,
it's a mid-apocalyptic.
or I actually try to characterize it as the hush period following unexplained occurrences that could foretell the apocalypse. Yeah, and it's not another world. It's not a mythical world. It's not a future world. It's not a visionary world. It's actually very realistic, and that was a very deliberate choice. And when Bria and I were writing the story, I'm from New York. I live in Los Angeles now, but I'm from New York, and I was actually living in New York when 9/11 happened, and Bria was in Austin. And so a lot of the inspiration for some of the things that happened, and the feeling of dread and the lack of awareness of what's going on in the world came from our conversations about our different experiences in the 48 hours or more after 9/11 happened. So in New York, it was and for me, I actually lived in the lockdown zone around the towers, and so the hush and the waiting and the bonding was very different than Bria's experience in Austin, where she felt that people were really panicky and afraid because they didn't know what was happening, and they kept thinking, in that lack of knowledge, that anything could happen at any moment. And it was funny when we told people this story idea. About 5 different folks said, I went to a huge drunken party post 9/11, where people were just freaking out and just getting wasted. This is maybe an American thing, I'm not sure. I didn't experience that in New York, and so we just traded experiences and sort of used those as inspiration.
They're going to chuck this out fairly quickly, but if anyone in the audience, Dave?
Yeah, thank you. 2 quick questions. The first one is, what was the length of the shoot from your opening to wrap? That was the first question. The second one's a little more controversial. Answer the first one first, because you might not answer this.
Okay. You mean how many days?
Yeah, to wrap.
For those low-budget independent filmmakers, shoot on film. Besides the fact that film is gorgeous, it's beautiful, and
It's running out.
yeah, it's running out. It will force you to be extremely economical and very efficient about your days of shooting, because you cannot afford the footage, or most specifically, you cannot afford to develop all of the footage. And in the age of digital filmmaking, I find that you can oftentimes just do 8 takes on one scene, and why bother? So we shot principal photography 17 days, and then we went back and did 5 days of additional photography. So it was 22 days total.
That's the first one out of the way. Now the second one. Obviously your character, I'm glad to get the first question out of the way. This is a little more controversial, and please take it in the sense it's meant.
Yeah, to the point.
Obviously you to differentiate between the 2 characters, Harriet's and yours. I assume that your character is not too autobiographical, because if it is, there'll be a very long queue of gentlemen to chat to you. That's why I waited.
Is that a question?
It's not too autobiographical.
Shades. Do you want me to
No,
quantify the
it's
shades of
meant to be
autobiography?
humorous, it's meant to be humorous.
Oh, okay.
It's not. Thank you.
I mean, I guess we could have touched on that a little bit earlier. Just how much did you draw from your own characters in order to form the ones we see on the screen?
I mean, I think I'm really interested in the way other writers talk about this, because in my experience, the characters really evolved. So from the time that we started writing to when we sort of said picture lock on the film was about 3 years. And what I didn't mention is in between principal and additional photography, we rewrote. So we had a period of months where we put together a rough cut and a director's cut, and just didn't feel like it was, people always told us you make a movie 3 times. The first time when you write it, the second time when you shoot it, and the third time when you edit it. And so when we got past the rough cut to the first pass, post-rough cut, it still wasn't there. It wasn't the story that we envisioned. The footage that we got didn't quite sync. And so we actually rewrote the beginning and the end. So this is a long-winded way of saying that the characters really evolved, and there are pieces of both of the characters in both me and Bria, quite honestly, and then also nothing to do with us whatsoever. Yeah. And I would also argue sometimes that we write characteristics of characters that are perhaps in opposition of who we are. So in that way, they're still related to us autobiographically. So that's a cagey way of saying. Do I sleep around with a lot of men? Absolutely not. Many of them.
Lady in the back.
Yeah. So was the countdown to the real disaster always? Did you always have that concept of the real disaster wasn't the disaster happening outside the main character's relationship, but the real disaster was what's happening within the relationship between the two characters? Was that always the idea from the beginning?
So no, it was always the idea that we were using this sort of the context of a potential nuclear apocalypse as the metaphor for the sort of potential eruption of their friendship. The clock was actually a device that Bria Grant, my director, co-writer, and co-star, developed in the editing process. So that actually wasn't written into our original script.
It works really well.
We went back and forth on it, and ultimately at the end, I think that it didn't really work well, but it was not a device that was intended from the beginning at all. Kind of sort of found it, and it was really Bria's inspiration.
I mean, one interesting aspect of that is it kind of comments on our expectations of these kind of movies, particularly Donnie Darko, which kind of has the countdown to time resetting itself, and he's an unreliable narrator. So there were points in the movie where I was wondering if your co-star was going to be turned out that she actually was still in a mental institution, and this was all in her head. So I'm glad you didn't go down that route.
Layers of content.
On that bombshell, we're going to have to call it a night. But are you going to be around a while in the bar to ask other people's questions?
Sure.
Cool. All right. That was a terrific movie, and thank you for staying here.